grief is the mechanism by which we deal with loss. It is a God-given mechanism, an escape valve even, to release the pain, the hurt, the disappointment of loss, grief, which is why we all need to grieve. We need to allow ourselves to grieve and allow others to grieve for as long as necessary, in the way that is necessary for that person, because not everybody grieves
the same way.
in the same way. Some need more time, some need less time.
Even for the same losses.
Even for the same loss.
We have all lost something in the past, or we are currently losing something, or we for sure lose something into the future. Pastor, loss is one of the biggest pains of human life.
True. And as you said, life is full of loss on different levels and in different capacities. We'll all be losing something. So yes. And when we lose something, there is pain.
That's the topic we really want to go into today, because loss as an area of life is one that impacts all of us, but to different degrees and in different forms. I think what we're hoping to do through this discussion today is to really lay out the landscape of the nature of loss, and then to hopefully help our listeners see what can come out of those difficult moments and very difficult situations.
I would even say, because we all suffer loss to one degree or another, and loss always causes disruption to our lives. This podcast, we are hoping, would present how we could confront loss in such a way that the disruption it causes is minimized, and we may be better able and better prepared to deal with loss and to move on with our lives after we have suffered this loss.
Yeah, so I guess let's start out by maybe making a definition of what loss is.
Loss simply means to be bereft of something, to have something taken away from you. To not be able to find something or have the use of something when you need it. So when we go into this, I think we shall be able to understand loss within our context.
Yeah. And I liked when you laid out how you see the categories of loss, because these two big categories of internal loss and external loss, or those losses of things inside versus the losses of things outside, really is a big umbrella that captures all the forms of losses that we experience as human beings.
True. But before we go there, let's look at loss where it started. Maybe Genesis 3:21 to 24 would be a good place to launch this.
It reads, "Also for Adam and his wife, the Lord God made tunics of skin and clothed them. Then the Lord God said, Behold, the man has become like one of us, to know good and evil. And now, lest he put out his hand and take also of the tree of life, and eat and live forever. Therefore, the Lord God sent him out of the Garden of Eden, to till the ground from which he was taken. So he drove out the man, and he placed cherubim at the east of the Garden of Eden, and the flaming sword which turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life."
All human loss began right there in the Garden of Eden. And that loss that Adam and Eve suffered is representative of everything human beings will ever lose throughout our history. For instance, Adam and Eve lost their innocence, because now, as God says, they now know good
And evil.
and evil. They lost trust, because now Adam is blaming Eve, Eve is blaming the serpent. There's a certain trust dimension that is lost. They lost their home. How do we know that? The Bible says God did what? Banished them
From the garden.
From the garden.
Yeah.
They lost their health and life, because from that moment on, they will begin to die, grow old and die. They lost their freedom and their autonomy, because now there's an angel guarding the tree of life. They can no longer enter into the garden. So that's a freedom to go and eat of the tree of life that has been lost. And of course, they lost their autonomy. Adam is no longer able to control his destiny, to control his actions or his life. Because with this new reality called sin that came, man will now find himself in slavery of different sorts from that point on.
In uncertainty, where he's not guarded by the presence of God.
Right. And so when we look at the loss of Adam and Eve, their innocence, their home, their health, their autonomy, their life, and everything, we see mirrored loss as it affects human beings from that point on.
Pastor, a quick question here, because it's interesting that their loss comes on the back end of them having this knowledge of good and evil. And I'm wondering, does that knowledge of good and evil have anything to do with the things we lose?
Explain what you mean by that. Chris.
Because the scripture now says that now that they have eaten of the tree of good and evil, we have to banish them before they eat the tree of life. It seems to me then that there is a correlation here between their accessing that tree of good and evil and the loss they experience after that.
Yes. Because when God says that they now know good and evil, He is saying they have lost their innocence. And a lot of what Adam and Eve would have maintained would be dependent on them maintaining innocence. By innocence, we mean without guile, pure. And that is what they lost, that purity, that guilelessness. They lost that.
Yeah. And also one other thing that you mentioned that they lost that maybe you could also frame for us here, maybe briefly, is the idea that in the garden they had the freedom of accessing all that there was except that tree. But you spoke about slavery now that they're walking out of the garden.
Yeah, a slave to circumstances, a slave to work. God says, no, you will have to work, and back-breaking work till you die. And we all know today we have to work, and it isn't always pleasant work. A lot of us are in jobs we hate, but we have to because we need to pay the bills. Yeah. It's raining, it's snowing, whatever it is, but we have to get up and go. And so we became a slave to circumstances and having to work, and now slaves to other things from within and slaves to things from without, which brings us to what you were saying at the beginning. When we consider loss, it is divided into two areas. Loss that happens to us, or things that happen to us, and a loss that happens in us, things that happen in us. Two ways we lose things. What happens to us and what happens in us. And I am suggesting that the more devastating loss is that which happens in us, because what happens in us will color how we view those things that happen to us. Mm-hmm. And if we are able to bounce back from those things that happen to us. So maybe as we go into the different areas of loss, we might be able to see how this plays out in real life.
Yeah, so let's start out with some of the examples of these losses, Pastor. What are some of these external losses that you're talking about?
Check Matthew 4:24. That should give us a good clue.
So Matthew 4:24 reads, "Then his fame went throughout all Syria, and they brought to him all sick people who were afflicted with various diseases and torments, and those who were demon-possessed, epileptics and paralytics, and he healed them."
Read it over again so we could get the real sense.
"Then his fame went throughout all Syria, and they brought to him all sick people who were afflicted with various diseases and torments, and those who were demon-possessed, epileptics and paralytics, and he healed them."
Yes. The most distinguishing aspect of Jesus' earthly ministry was his healing people. There were so many sick people, demon-possessed, physically ailing, whether it was blindness, whether it was being crippled, whether it was that woman with a menstrual problem. Sickness was just rampant throughout.
People had lost their health.
People who had lost their health.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that ever since Adam and Eve ate the fruit and were put out of the garden, they began to get older and their bodies began to break down. And really, disease is simply your body breaking down, not able to defend itself against the onslaught of germs and stuff on the outside, or the natural deterioration that's happening on the inside. Jesus came and began to heal people because poor health affects how we are able to navigate. When you're sick, can you go to work?
No.
No, when you're sick, you can't really have fun and enjoy life in its fullness. So sickness becomes that situation that really takes away from us our ability to enjoy life to the fullest, to do the things we want to do. And it always reminds us that death is just around the corner. And when we look at Jesus' ministry, he healed Jairus' daughter. He healed the woman with the menstrual problem. The Bible calls it an issue of blood. He healed blind Bartimaeus. He healed the leper. That's a good thing that God brought healing, because that was something we lost. Good, vibrant physical health. When we lost that, God said, I have to restore that. He even told Israel, I am the Lord, your healer. He said, if you obey my commands, none of the diseases that attack the Egyptians will come upon you, because I am the Lord, your healer. But in talking about sickness, Joel, let's look at it in the context of today. In the 18th century and 19th century and earlier on in man's history, people lived to be 40, 50 years old, usually ravaged by disease, by infection. But with modern medicine, we have been able to keep infection and infectious diseases at bay. There are people living today who would have died in the 17th or 18th century. We are able to bring people back from accidents who would have had no hopes today. But with that same thing, it means we are living longer. And as we live longer, the ravages of old age are being felt in an aging population. I'm talking about those chronic degenerative diseases that are just part of our existence, especially in the West. Cancer, diabetes, hypertension, things like Alzheimer's and dementia are part of our lives today because people are living longer and losing more of their physical capacities. In this world in which we live, health insurance has become a necessary thing, and there are a lot of people who don't have health insurance. So if I'm sick, I have no choice but to deal with it. Maybe try to get some over-the-counter pain med, but I'm really sick and I need to go to the doctor. So we are dealing with a population whereby there are a lot of people who have no means by which to deal with the ravages to their body. And I'm suggesting that something that we should all do is to have an advance directive, also called a living will, and a power of attorney, a health power of attorney. And you might be wondering, what is an advance directive? It is when I say, this is what I would like you to do or not do for me, when I get that sick that I cannot make my own decisions. As you know, when you go to the doctor, he says, can we do this? Would you like this? Would you like that? And you have to consent. But sometimes we get so ill, maybe you're in a coma, maybe you're dementia, Alzheimer's, and you can't make those decisions anymore. Well, an advance directive, a living will says, this is what I want to be done or not done. And it saves your relatives from having to make that hard decision. A power of attorney says, on the other hand, this is who I would like to be in charge of my health. So you may say, I want my son or my wife to make any health decisions for me if I should become incapacitated. So a power of attorney gives that person the authority to decide, yes, pull the plug or keep them on a ventilator or whatever have you.
So I guess then here you're laying out how we should prepare ourselves for these losses that are as a result of sickness.
Yes. The loss of our capacity to think and make decisions. The loss of our physical strength to go from this place to that place. The loss of autonomy even. When that happens, we need to have made that decision beforehand so that we are treated with the dignity we would like, and also to avoid our family having to quarrel and bicker. Yes, pull the plug, but brother says, no, don't pull the plug. Sister says, let's continue tube feeding, but uncle says, no, we shouldn't, mommy. Avoid that by having an advance directive, or at least put it in the hands of someone you know is trustworthy. So one of the main losses that happens to us is sickness.
Mm-hmm.
And with sickness, what's the next thing that comes?
It's death,
Yes,
really.
Death. 1 Corinthians 15:26 says, death is the last enemy. Why do you think it's called the last enemy, death?
It's the last blow, really, that extinguishes life form. It completely takes you out of the scene altogether.
Yes. It's the most permanent of all the losses we can have on that plane of things that happen to us. Because when somebody dies, what does Ecclesiastes 9:4 say? That would be a good text.
It reads, "But for him who is joined to all the living, there is hope. For a living dog is better than a dead lion."
A living dog is better. Why do you think he says a living dog is better than a dead lion?
Because a dead lion has nothing to say and nothing to do and no abilities, no capacity.
So even if in life a lion is considered
Strong,
and he's considered the king of the beast, lion, and a dog, well, just a dog, But Solomon is saying, when death comes, even the lion, even the king, goes back to the dust. He has nothing but a dog, even a stray dog. Even a dog that's on the street is better off because this dog can eat, he can move and do things. In the same way, it doesn't matter if I'm a billionaire. When I die, I die. There's nothing I can do about it. But a living man, even if he's poor, still has life. And with life, every other thing is possible. Because if you're dead, it doesn't matter what there is. But if I'm alive, there's still that possibility. So death becomes the greatest loss on that plane of things that happen to us. Because with death, there's permanence. My wife will never come back. My brother, I'll never see him again. My father is gone forever. And the thing about death, because it's an enemy, is that it takes everything from us and we cannot win him. Death is unconquerable. Even doctors die. Even if you exercise and you eat well and you do all the things and you take your supplements, you will still die. There's nothing more certain in life than death. And that's a sad, sad reality that we all face. And that is why when we go to a funeral, we are so touched and moved, and it resonates in our soul in such a way, it ricochets from one side of our soul to the next and break us down, because we see in that uncle, that aunt, that friend, that wife, whatever it is, a testament of where I am going. And also that this person has been snatched away from me. So death is a great loss.
So, Pastor, and it's interesting even in terms of just acknowledging and recognizing the reality of death, that as believers then we have to stand at it a lot more differently.
In what sense?
In terms of how we see that, because it's for somebody who's non-believing, death marks a finality, and as you were saying, it conquers all. But for a believer, that's a perspective you hold on to with another perspective.
And what's the other perspective?
That there's yet again the hope that we'll live.
In other words, you're taking Paul's words to the Thessalonians in 1 Thessalonians 4:13. If you could find that, maybe that would help.
But I do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning those who have fallen asleep, lest you sorrow as others who have no hope.
Yes. In other words, he's saying, grieve, but don't grieve like those who have no hope. The hope that you're talking about, that death will be swallowed up in victory. Oh, death, where's your sting? Oh, grave, where's your victory? That's the hope that you and I hold on to. That the finality of death, the certainty of death, is counteracted by the certainty of the resurrection. And that life evermore, that glorious life to come. And that is why Christians grieve, but they grieve with hope.
A different type of grieving, really.
It's a different type of grieving. It's a grief with hope. And we're going to come to grief in a moment, but at least let's acknowledge that as a Christian, there's something that keeps you going. Even as I think about my father, I always think about what it would be like to see him again. And that in itself gives me a joy within. I will see my dad again if I remain faithful to God. So we've seen health and death. But there's another loss that is big. It's our wealth. Remember Job? What happened to Job?
Job is a very complex story. A lot of things happened to
In the
Job.
context that we're talking about losing
He lost
things.
everything. He did lose everything that was had any meaning in his life, really. His family, his friends,
But what
his
else?
health.
What else? Be concrete. He lost
His
his
wealth,
He
yes.
he lost his ships, his business, everything. In fact, at the beginning, when he experienced loss and his wife came to him, he said, "Hey, naked came I into the world, and naked I'll go." Job 1:21. He said, "I came into this world naked, and I'll go back naked." And Job didn't curse God. He didn't sin with his mouth because Job recognized, you know what? Life happens.
Is that a posture that we should all adopt even as we go through life? That realization, or at least that acknowledgement of our state of really stewardship rather than ownership.
True, because it all belongs to God. As if when the gold belongs to God, even though we think, but this is my car, my house. So that sense of stewardship, I'm only holding on to this, should be uppermost in our minds. And we should be able to let go as Job was able to let go.
Yeah, because I think at times that's the difficulty. That ability to live with a loose handle on things such that if they go, they don't go with you.
You're not devastated.
Yes, they don't destroy you because you lose them.
Like Paul says, with much or with little, I've learned to be content. That's a great spirit. But in life, sometimes you lose your job, which brings in our ability to take care of ourselves. Do you know, Joel, that in America today, there are over 6.2 million people who are unemployed, people who cannot find the jobs. We are not talking about people who don't want to work. We are talking about people who cannot find the jobs. 6.2 million people who ask themselves the question, how will I pay my bills? How will I keep the light on? Joblessness is a serious thing because it eats away at your sense of self. It eats away at your ability to take care of your needs. And sometimes we lose our jobs when these greedy CEOs milk the country dry, the company dry, and make decisions that put our welfare at stake. And while they are drawing millions in salary, there are workers who can barely pay their bills with the minimum wages that they're getting. So while a McDonald's worker is just making a minimum wage, the CEO is making millions in salary. But then there's homelessness. They tell me there are about 50% of Americans who are just one paycheck away from homelessness.
So it's a real concern. It's a real issue.
Yes, because right now, there are almost 1 million Americans, and I'm sure it's the same in other countries. I've been to the countries in Africa, and I see homelessness there too as well. But at least in this country, this rich, powerful country, the greatest country they say in the world, there are almost 1 million homeless people on the streets of America right now who live in their cars and shelters, even on the streets, homeless. And some of them, it wasn't because they were on drugs or anything. It's just life happened to them. Again, greedy CEOs, greedy landlords who raise the rent, conglomerates that break down buildings in poor neighborhoods and put them out of the reach of the poor. That loss can be devastating when you lose your home and realize I have no place to stay. I have lost my job and I have no money to take care of my needs. Those are very devastating losses that we deal with every day as well. And of course, we can lose our friends. Through death, he or she dies. Through migration or separation. Hey, I got a job in California, so I'll be leaving from next month, or I'm leaving Kenya to go to America, or I'm leaving America to go to England. Separation. And then we lose our friends sometimes through gossip and misunderstanding, which is the saddest way to lose your friends, because you and that friend had a misunderstanding, a miscommunication, and one thing led to another, and our friendship is broken, or someone gossiped about you to a friend who happened to believe it. And instead of coming to you and finding out the truth, they just accepted what they heard and they stopped talking to you. That is even worse because you're seeing your friend every day, maybe at church, maybe on your job. It's different if the friend moved away for a job or something. You don't see them. But I'm seeing this person every day. But yet we can't share that love and camaraderie that we once did. So sometimes we even lose our friends. And I'm saying these are the 4 major areas of things that happen to us.
External to our own being.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
But like I said before, they cannot be compared with the things that happen in us. When the loss we suffer is an internal loss. So we're going to look a bit at these internal losses. What was the first thing we said Adam and Eve lost?
Their innocence.
Innocence.
Mm-hmm.
The innocence. Innocence, that sense of being without corruption, being without guile or deception, being pure. Having an eye that look at the world with beauty and sees only the good in the world. That's the innocence that they lost. And we lose as we grow older. But I was thinking about children who lose their innocence even as children. How important is innocence to children, Joel? What do you think?
I think it's critical. It's a core part of a wholesome development. And as you were saying, to be able to have that perspective of a good world, at least in those initial stages, is so important to develop a sense of identity and a sense of worth and a sense of reason for being. And I think if that is taken away, it can destroy how you formulate your reality.
Many adults are messed up adults because their innocence was taken away as children. No, that innocence can be taken away by violence in the home, by abuse, not being treated well, not having enough to eat, not being sheltered and protected by circumstances in your neighborhood. So that loss of innocence is happening. But normally, if you're in a good home as a child, you're being sheltered and protected by your parents, by your church. So you grow up still thinking the world is a beautiful place. Oh, how I love Jesus. It's a beautiful world. And as you grow older, your mind is now able to deal with the harshness of life.
With that buffer, yeah.
Yes, because you've been buffered and grown into the loss of innocence. But I'm talking about innocence that is snatched away from you. That messes you up. And that is why sexual abuse of children is such a heinous crime. Because it robs that child of his innocence, of her innocence. It snatches it away, destroys it. And just like death is final, the loss of innocence is final. You can never regain innocence once it's lost. And that is why it is a crime that should move us all to do something about it whenever we see a child being abused, physically, emotionally, and especially sexually. That loss of innocence now carries with it a loss of hope and trust. What do you think happens to someone who loses hope?
They become desperate. I will imagine that a hopeless life is a life that is really terminal. There is no reason to anticipate or look forward to the future.
What do people do when they become hopeless in the way you're talking about?
I mean, one of the things that is become clear is they commit suicide. They take away their lives.
Usually that's the end result of hopelessness. Is why am I living? There's no use in living. I'm not worth anything. To lose hope is devastating. It puts you in depression. Now, depression could either be physiological, meaning my brain isn't functioning the way it should. And with medication and therapy, I could function well. But there's depression that is emotional, where I have been devastated by a loss, by something that happened to me, a betrayal, whatever have you. And so now I'm just down in the dumps. Again, with therapy, with support, I can make it. But depression is a terrible thing. And do you know many people suffer with depression, Joel? In America, they say over 25% of the population suffer with depression. Serious depression, clinical depression, who need medication and need help to navigate life. And they tell me depression is like going into a dark room where there's no light, and sometimes you're in there for days without end, and everything that seems hopeless. Even being a Christian, you can be suffering from depression. And so we should never be afraid or ashamed if we are suffering from depression to look for help. Because without help, you can never enjoy life. And you could even do harm to yourself. So we talk about the loss of innocence, of hope, and the loss of trust. What would cause someone to lose trust?
It's when expectations are not met, or at least certain promises are not kept.
And I was depending on it. So what would be a word that would best describe this situation whereby I find myself losing trust in you or in someone else?
Betrayal?
Yes. Trust is only lost when we feel betrayed by those we had confidence in. So what kind of things could create this kind of distrust or betrayal in a family? What things in a family, especially even in relationships, could cause me to feel betrayed?
I mean, at least within spouses, it's could be cheating, for example.
Right. Adultery, yes.
Adultery is a big one. It could be falsehood, lying.
Lying, true. Do you think like domestic violence could create
Yes.
domestic violence?
Violence is a big one as well.
Abuse, like sexual abuse, verbal abuse, physical abuse. We mentioned it in our last podcast on family unity, that the one place I expect to be loved and accepted, nurtured and protected is where?
In the family.
In the family, in my home, with my mommy, my daddy, my brothers and my sisters. This is where I begin to learn trust and confidence, and I can do it in the world. So if in this place that is nurturing me, I find myself being dropped to the ground, I can't trust them because they've abused me, they've beaten me, they've called me foolish and ugly, and they've abused me sexually, then I am messed up. Who do I trust then? But in a situation like this where there's abuse and violence, even adultery, that doesn't mean that all is over. Because trust can be regained. Did you know that trust can be regained?
I will imagine not in its complete form, but it can be regained.
Why do you say not in its complete form?
For me, trust is much closer to innocence, in a way. And once it's lost, there are elements that are very hard to rebuild back into place.
So it is difficult to rebuild trust, no question. But it can be rebuilt. And sometimes even becomes stronger, depending on how it is dealt with and navigated. Now, innocence can never be regained. I can never close my eyes to the evil in the world once I've seen it. But trust, I can begin to trust you again. And that trust, of course, will call for confession and forgiveness, which we'll come to in a moment. But yes, in a situation where I lose trust, my whole foundation for life and for living becomes shaky. I become very tentative. Again, these are things that happen
Within
us. Mm-hmm. So I lost my innocence, I lost my hope, I lost my trust. And then I lose my autonomy or my freedom, the ability to say no when I have to, the ability to control my destiny, what I will do and will not do. So now something outside of me has become inside of me and is controlling me. Paul called it sin in my body in Romans chapter 7. He says, I don't understand what I do. The things I don't want to do,
I find myself doing those.
and the things that I want to do,
I don't.
He's a wretched man that I am, who will deliver me. He said, but I realize there's something in me called sin that wars against the law of my mind. So when a drug addict sometimes says, I'm going to stop taking cocaine, I'm going to stop smoking, I'm going to stop drinking alcohol, do you think he really means it many times?
Nope.
You don't think he means it many times?
I think they mean it, but then they don't have the capacity within themselves to carry through.
So he means it, like Paul says, I serve God with the law of my mind. I desire the law of God. I love the law of God. I know what is right and I want to do it. But I find what?
I'm powerless.
I'm powerless. This law in my body, this sin.
There's a loss of capacity, a loss of that agency.
Yes. If we were talking to psychologists today or to psychiatrists, they would say what we are describing is the big A word. addiction. Addiction. We don't fully understand addiction. And sometimes we tend to judge people as being, weak-willed and wanting to. But the truth is, Joel, we are all capable of being addicted. In fact, all human beings become addicted to some degree of or another. The problem is when that addiction is a negative one, a dangerous one like the drugs or alcohol or sex or something like that. But there are people who are addicted to work. People who are addicted to sleep, even to religions. The point is, our genetic inheritance, our social upbringing, our childhood training, all of these play into us, and the possibility and our capacity to become addicted. I want to repeat that. Our genetic inheritance. We know that children of alcoholic parents have a greater affinity to become alcoholics.
Mm-hmm.
And we are sure in other areas too. Children of sex addicts would probably be more prone to become sex addicts themselves. But how you are grown up, the kind of home you grew up in, could lead you down a road of addiction. Also, the society you grew up in, the cultural and social environment in which you grow, also play in your potential for addiction. So we need to stop judging those who fell through the cracks, who because of the interplay of a genetic inheritance, of a social malfunction, of a home dysfunction, push them over the edge into a negative form of addiction.
And we ourselves should be more conscious and really maybe be auditing ourselves on what our addictions may be.
Yes. And it may be something good, but yet anything that controls me is bad.
Yeah, if people get addicted to things like work,
yes,
or food.
Food, yes. Normally good things, but as Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, he says, I will not allow myself to be mastered by anything. Wow, that's a great way to live. I will not allow myself to be mastered by anything or anyone except for God. And even God doesn't force himself on us. He still gives us that freedom to choose. These are the things that happen in us. The losses that happen in us. When I lose my autonomy, my ability to say no and maintain my freedom. Because like we said many seasons ago, freedom is not being able to do what you want, when you want it, how you want it. Freedom, true freedom, is the ability to say no when I need to. That's the freedom that most of us don't have. That isn't preached or taught. That freedom is being able to say no when I need to. So yes, I may want to do this and it may be nice to do that, but I know this is not the time or the place for me to do this or that, or this is not something I should be doing even, and I'm able to say, no, I will not do it. That is the true freedom. Not to just give in to every impulse and to do what I want, when I want it, where I want it, and that kind of stuff. To lose that is to lose a very important aspect of our humanity. That aspect of our humanity that relinks us to God and allows us to forge ahead in a pathway of positivity, of success. That is why, like I said, what happens in us could be more devastating than what happens
outside of us.
Mm-hmm. So basically, Joel, we are talking about loss. But all loss brings grief. Even if you lose your keys, you grieve. That sounds rational.
Yeah.
How would you grieve if you lose your keys?
I will wonder what has happened and how I can reconnect with them and maybe if I may never access them again. There's pain there. There is a sense of frustration, disappointment, a sense of
anger, doubt even, and blaming. All of these are things that happen on the greater levels of grief. I'm sure I had my keys here. Who moved my keys? I'm sure it's my son. I'm sure it's my wife. She's always moving my stuff. Man, I need to leave now and I can't leave. So you go through all this turmoil. How can I have lost these keys? I mean, how could I have been so foolish to have left my keys, at the office? How could I? And we go through all that until you kind of resolve yourself. Well, guess what? Grief is the mechanism by which we deal with loss. It is a God-given mechanism, an escape valve even to release the pain, the hurt, the disappointment of loss, grief, which is why we all need to grieve. We need to allow ourselves to grieve and allow others to grieve for as long as necessary in the way that is necessary for that person, because not everybody grieves
the same way.
in the same. Some need more time, some need less time.
Even for the same losses.
Even for the same losses. So we may all be grieving the loss of our father, but one person just cries and wants to throw themselves on the coffin, and another person is all stoic and calm, but they're grieving. One person needs to talk, and they keep talking about daddy and talking about dad. One other person may just start eating. The process of grief is established. Doubt, shock, anger, blame, resolution, and all of this. But the sequence is different for each one. There's a great book. It is called The ABCs of Grieving. I think it's a great book that people should read, that every church should have a few copies. The ABCs of Grieving by Don Smith, DM, Doctor of Ministry, in which he talks about grief and how we can grieve in a healthy manner, because there is healthy grief and there is
unhealthy
grief. Unhealthy grief makes me an eternal victim. I get stuck in one of those places, usually in the blame or the victim. Oh, why me? This shouldn't have happened to me, Or it's because of your fault. He fell out the window. If you were the king, and you start blaming others, that is unhealthy grief. Or you stay in one phase and you're locked in there. That is unhealthy grief. But healthy grief is just to allow those emotions to flow over you. Take time away. Take time out. Acknowledge, I am missing my dad. I'm missing my wife. I'm missing my brother. Oh, whatever the case might be. I don't know why they fired me. I was a good worker. Allow yourself to feel your grief.
It's important. Because otherwise you transmit that and you project that out, maybe even in ways that are unconscious. The way you treat people and the way you interact with your environment may be a means of you injecting that anger within you into the environment, if it's not properly grieved.
Or even the sadness and despondency.
Yeah.
So Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 4:13, he says, we grieve not as those who have no hope. Note he didn't say we do not grieve. And there are Christians who are quick to say, no, don't grieve. How could you do this? Isn't Jesus your Lord and Savior? We will meet your dad again. And no, let me grieve. Let me grieve. The scripture doesn't say we should not grieve. Job grieved. Job cried out and he was in anguish. He grieved. In fact, when Moses died, Deuteronomy 34, it tells us they grieved for him 30 days, a whole month of weeping and wailing for Moses. We look in scripture and we see people grieve. Why? Because grief is healthy. It's the mechanism by which we are able to deal with loss. If not, we implode, we destroy ourselves if we don't allow ourselves to grieve and allow others to grieve. So please, brothers and sisters, leave that Bible text for another time. Leave that sermonette for another time. When someone is going through the throes of grief and pain, a hug, a smile, just I'm with you in this. If you need me, call on me, will suffice. Keep the Bible study. Keep the sermonette. It doesn't work. It doesn't help. You are invalidating that person's grief, and grief is a natural result of loss. All loss, physical loss, emotional loss, spiritual loss, like I said, be it of your job, be it of a loved one, of your health, they bring grief, and we need to allow ourselves to grieve. And so, we hope that as you have listened to today's episode, you would have been able to recognize the many ways in which loss afflicts us all, but also would have received from this podcast some pointers as to how best to confront loss, to face loss, and even deal with loss. And remember, like we said, allow yourselves to grieve that loss, because it is only as we grieve that we are able to move on, that we are able to forgive others, that we are able to be repaired and made whole again.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Let Us Go Deeper. Let Us Go Deeper is an independent ministry, and your support is critical to operations. please make any contributions that you can to patreon.com/LUGD. That is patreon.com/LUGD.